The man stood alone, just inside the courtroom door. His coat hung loose, a bit too big for his frame, and his shoes had long lost their shine. He held a worn ID card between both hands, gently, like something breakable. Why did no one greet him? Why did a few in the gallery glance over and snicker, as if he'd wandered into the wrong room? He didn't speak. He just waited. Not every story begins with noise. Some begin with silence, and a presence too easy to overlook. Not every story gets told. But if you're hearing this, maybe someone is finally being remembered. Here, we tell the stories that almost faded away. Subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories, where memory finds its voice. The courtroom wasn't full that morning. Just enough people to fill a few rows: clerks, a couple of attorneys, one man tapping his phone, a woman whispering behind her hand. The hum of conversation hovered like static, low and careless. But the man by the door didn't seem to notice. Or maybe, he noticed everything. He walked forward slowly, not out of weakness, but with the careful rhythm of someone who'd learned to be steady when others weren't. His steps made no sound on the carpet, but something in the air shifted when he passed. When he reached the defense table, he set the ID card down. Didn't slide it. Didn't toss it. Just placed it. The card was old, corners softened, laminate yellowed, the photo faded like a memory you'd squint at to recall. No one asked him who he was. No one offered a seat. It was like he'd shown up uninvited to a party he helped build. In the judge's chair, a woman in her late 50s flipped through a file, then paused. Her eyes lifted, but she didn't say a word. And still, the man stood. Straight, still, quiet. As if waiting for something sacred to begin, not a trial, not a verdict, just acknowledgement. But the gavel hadn't dropped yet. And sometimes, silence carries more weight than any sentence. He didn't sit down. Not even when the bailiff motioned quietly toward the chair beside the defense table. The man, Jacob Rawlins, though no one had called him that yet, just stood there. Hands loosely folded in front of him. His eyes didn't wander. They stayed fixed on the empty space in front of the judge's bench, like it mattered more than any wall or window. A clerk scribbled something on a notepad, glanced up, then back down. No name tag. No legal representation. No one by his side. The prosecutor, a younger man in a sharp gray suit, leaned over to whisper something to the bailiff. They exchanged a look, half confusion, half impatience. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. Does he even know why he's here? Jacob didn't answer. He wasn't ignoring them. He just hadn't been spoken to. His coat was old wool, dark and brushed clean, but the seams at the shoulder sagged where rank patches once were. On the inside pocket, a corner of a folded document peeked out, creased, yellowed, carefully carried. A woman in the gallery shifted in her seat. He's just some drifter, she muttered, too loud for it to be a secret. Someone snorted. No one objected. Jacob blinked, once. A slow blink, like he'd learned not to respond too quickly. He reached into his coat. Not sudden, not defensive, just quiet. And when he pulled out the document, it wasn't to make a point. It was to hold on to something. Still, no one said his name. No one asked where he'd come from. They just looked at him like he was extra. Like he'd stepped into a room where his presence made others uncomfortable. But he didn't flinch. He had stood in worse places before. And right now, all he asked, without a word, was to be seen. The sound started small. A single chuckle from the back row. Dry, careless. Like someone had just read a joke in a headline they didn't finish. Then another followed. This time sharper, cutting through the hush of the room like a zipper splitting fabric. It was the moment the clerk lifted Jacob's old ID. Held it between two fingers, tilted it slightly, as if unsure what she was even looking at. The laminate was cloudy, edges curled. There was a faint photo, the kind time erases gently but surely. She leaned toward the prosecutor and whispered something. He smiled. A short, half-smirk. And then it happened. A voice from the gallery, male, maybe middle-aged, not trying to whisper. Looks like he pulled that out of a time capsule. Laughter followed. Not roaring. Not cruel. Just the kind of laughter people let out when they're trying to feel bigger than someone else. Jacob didn't move. He didn't look at them. He didn't clutch the table or shake his head. He simply lowered his hand from the ID card and let it rest on the table beside it. Like he was setting down something that didn't belong to just him anymore. Like whatever they saw, whatever they thought they saw, wasn't something he needed to defend. Someone coughed. The room started to settle. But the echo of that laughter, it stayed. Hung in the quiet like smoke after a match. The judge hadn't spoken yet. She was still looking at the ID. And her hand, which had paused mid-page earlier, now rested flat on the bench. Jacob stood there, alone in his silence. Not fragile. Not proud. Just still, like a man who knew too well the sound of being dismissed. The room had settled into an uneasy stillness. The kind that doesn't come from respect, but from uncertainty. The ID card lay on the table. Untouched. Unclaimed. Almost like it didn't belong to anyone anymore. Judge Porter finally moved. She didn't clear her throat. Didn't tap the gavel. She just stood. Slowly. Like the weight of the moment had added years to her body. The whispering stopped. Chairs creaked as people shifted in their seats, trying to figure out what she was doing. She stepped down from the bench. Each footfall was soft but deliberate. No rush. No performance. She walked past the clerk's desk. Past the prosecutor, who opened his mouth but didn't speak. And then, without a word, she stood across from Jacob. Face to face. He didn't flinch. Didn't look up. Not yet. Judge Porter let out a slow breath. Then raised her right hand, level, steady, crisp. It was a salute. Perfectly formed. Held just long enough to hush whatever doubt still lingered in the room. Only then did Jacob lift his eyes. He didn't return the salute. But something in his expression softened. Not surprise. Not pride. Just recognition, quiet and deeply human. A man who had waited far too long. To simply be seen. As who he was. No one in the courtroom said anything. There was nothing to say. The salute had said it all. No one moved. The judge's hand lowered slowly, her posture still firm, but there was a shift, something unseen, like a door opening somewhere in the air between them. She looked down at the ID again. Then up at Jacob. Her voice, when it came, was steady. Not loud. Not formal. Just intentional. State your name for the record, sir. Jacob hesitated, not because he didn't remember, but because it had been so long since anyone asked. Jacob Rawlins, he said. His voice was low, roughened by age and silence. But clear. And final. She nodded once. Not as a formality, but as if acknowledging something deeper than procedure. From the gallery, someone whispered the name under their breath. Then again, a little louder. Jacob Rawlins. It moved through the room like a ripple. A name repeated not out of habit, but as a recognition. A reintroduction. People sat straighter. Not because they were told to. But because something about hearing it out loud made them want to. He stood taller, too. Not by force, but by relief. Like a burden he didn't know he still carried had just shifted off his back. The clerk picked up her pen. Paused. Then wrote his name on the form slowly, as if spelling it mattered more than it had 5 minutes ago. Jacob didn't smile. But something about his hands, how they relaxed just slightly at his sides, said everything. That was all he wanted. Not applause. Not sympathy. Just his name. Spoken. And heard. The clerk had been quiet until then. Young, maybe late 20s. Hair pulled back neat, expression careful, like someone who had learned to stay one step ahead of mistakes. She'd been doing her job, typing notes, moving papers, staying invisible. Until now. Her eyes returned to the ID card. It was still there on the table, right where Jacob had placed it. She leaned in, closer this time. Not out of duty. Out of something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or respect. She picked it up slowly. No more two-finger pinch. This time, with both hands, like it might fall apart if she didn't treat it right. The corners were worn down, soft as cloth. The lettering was faint. But you could still see it, U.S. Army across the top, the photo of a much younger man beneath. She looked at it longer than necessary. Long enough that the judge noticed. Long enough that the room felt it. Then she turned to Jacob. She didn't smile. Didn't force it. Just asked, quietly, "How long have you kept this?" Jacob met her eyes. It was the first real eye contact he'd made since walking in. "Since I came home," he said. A pause. Then, "It was the only thing that still knew my name." The clerk looked down again. Her thumb brushed the edge of the card. And something in her posture shifted. Not dramatically. But enough. Maybe it was the way her shoulders dropped. Or the way she passed the card back with both hands, gently, like handing back a folded flag. No one said anything else. But everyone watched her now. Because sometimes it only takes one person to look twice. For the whole room to see differently. There was no dramatic music. No swelling anthem. No flag waved in the air. Just a room full of people who, for the first time all morning, didn't know where to look. Jacob remained standing. His hands at his sides now, empty. The ID card had been returned, folded back into the breast pocket of his coat, where it always lived. The judge returned to her bench. She didn't speak right away. Her gavel remained untouched. And still, no one clapped. But that didn't make the silence hollow. It made it deeper. A man in the second row stood up. No gesture. No nod. Just stood. Then another, an older woman, her purse still in her lap, eyes misty but steady. She didn't stand to follow. She stood to honor. Row by row, one by one, people began rising. Not like an ovation. Like a memory surfacing. Like something long forgotten finally being named out loud. The air in the courtroom changed. Not cooler. Not warmer. Just heavier, like a truth had taken its rightful place in the room. Jacob didn't acknowledge them. Not out of pride. But because this wasn't about him. It was about everyone who had ever left a courtroom, or a war, or a street corner, unseen. It was about being acknowledged without fanfare. Respected without noise. There was no applause. But there was reverence. And sometimes, the quiet carries further than the clapping ever could. Jacob didn't linger. Once the judge resumed her seat and the moment had settled, he reached for the ID again. Not hurried. Not hesitant. He slid it from his pocket and looked down at it for a beat longer than before, just enough to make you wonder what memories were folded into its worn plastic. Then, with the same quiet care he'd carried into the courtroom, he tucked it back into his coat. But something had changed. Not in the card itself, it was still faded, still fraying at the edges. What changed was the way the room now regarded it. As if it wasn't just a piece of outdated identification, but a living record. A relic with breath. The bailiff stepped forward with a soft nod, indicating the formalities were finished. Jacob offered no complaint. He simply adjusted the hem of his coat and turned to leave. No one stopped him. No one asked for more. But the clerk, her name tag now visible, Emily, stood behind her desk and followed him with her eyes. Not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who had finally seen what had been there the whole time. Judge Porter remained still behind the bench. Her gavel untouched. But she watched too. Watched the way Jacob's back remained straight as he walked. Watched how the silence in the room stayed respectful, not awkward. As if everyone had agreed, without a word, to hold something sacred. Just before reaching the door, Jacob paused. Not to turn around. Not to make a speech. He simply placed one hand lightly over the spot where the ID rested against his chest. Then nodded. Once. And stepped out. The door clicked shut behind him, softer than expected. But the weight of what had just happened didn't go with him. It stayed. In the eyes of those who had laughed. In the breath Judge Porter let out as she finally reached for the gavel. In the silence that said, "That was not just a card. That was a man's name. A man's life. And we nearly forgot." In a quiet courtroom, an old man stood holding nothing more than a worn military ID, faded, bent, and almost forgotten by time. Yet in that silence, through laughter that should never have been, and a salute that needed no explanation, we were reminded of something deeply human: honor doesn't fade just because we stop looking for it. Jacob Rawlins didn't ask for applause. He didn't raise his voice. All he wanted was to be called by his name, once more, with dignity. And when that happened, the room changed. Because sometimes, recognition is not about grand gestures. It's about seeing the people we've overlooked for far too long. How many Jacobs walk among us today, unseen, unspoken to, carrying a past we've never bothered to ask about? If this story moved you, or made you think twice about the silent veterans in your own community, take a moment. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories, where forgotten names are given voice, and quiet moments of dignity are never lost again. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered. Don't they?